I'm going to use the microphone because of the mask, so if you can't hear me, let me know or whatever. But thank you guys so much for coming out and for coming in the unique situation that we're all in. My name's Nandini Makrandi. I'm the head curator here, and along with other staff, I worked on the F word, we mean female. We came up with the idea of an exhibit about women artists. It was originally called Feminism and Fabric, which now sounds really duddy to me, like silly. But anyway, 3 years ago, we were talking about the fact that we had 5 or 6 works that had fabric. And you can't put fabric on view very often. It's light sensitive. And they were kind of big. And we wanted to do a focused exhibit on that by women artists. And then we decided, well, there's a lot of work by women artists that don't get out as often as we'd like because of fragility or scale. And so we built this exhibit, and we wanted you to know that first and foremost, that women artists are a priority at the museum. And I don't just mean that now, but for the last 20 years, we have really made it an acquisition priority. We've added nearly 100 works to our collection by female artists in that time. We've added a lot of works to our collection, but 100 of those are by women artists. So we wanted you to see some of them and to see them together in a space and see the energy they have with each other. So that was our first reason for kind of expanding the show. The second is that it's the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage in the United States, which the actual date was, I think, 2 days ago. And Tennessee had a huge role to play, a significant role, in passing the 19th Amendment. So it was a good year to do this exhibit and to commemorate that as well. Of course, just because an amendment passes and the law changes doesn't mean everyone gets everything, right? Equity takes a long time. And over the course of the last 100 years, you still had the women's rights movement come and grow. You have the civil rights movement growing all the time. You have the gay liberation movement. And as these socio-political things are happening, so is an art movement. And specifically for women, it was the feminist art movement, okay? So, and the reason that's important is because some of the works upstairs kind of come out of this idea, out of these thoughts and dialogues. So, let me see if I can do this. So, what do you think? Have there been any great women artists? Okay, I want you to name 5 artists that are not Mary Cassatt and not Georgia O'Keeffe and not Frida Kahlo.
Diane Arbus.
Diane Arbus. Okay, anyone else?
Mary Cassatt.
Mary Cassatt, still on Mary Cassatt. Okay. Yes, ma'am. Jenny Holzer, and we have one on view here. You had one. Okay. Yes, sir.
Agnes Varda, who's a director, and also Leonora Carrington.
Okay. So you guys know a few, but you know, in the pre-internet days when I went to school, they would say this in a class, and people came up with Georgia O'Keeffe, Mary Cassatt, and maybe Artemisia Gentileschi, if you studied art history, who was a Baroque artist, who was a student of Caravaggio. So those were the 3 women, if you were lucky, that were in an art history book. And even today, you will, in the internet days, you will see these posted on museum sites. Name 5 women artists. Name 1 woman artist that's not these famous people. So Linda Nochlin, who is one of our foremost feminist art historians in this country, wrote an article that was considered very radical in 1971, and it was called, "Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?" So she didn't say, have there been? She said, why have there not been? So she was kind of positing the idea that there had not been. And she argued that they weren't simply underrepresented in art history books, but that they didn't exist. And she said the reason for that was that they were systematically shut out of the privileges that male artists had. For generations, for centuries, couldn't have apprenticeships, couldn't go to the same schools or classes. The way a painter showed their prowess was to paint the nude or to paint the human figure. Women were not allowed to paint nudes, male or female, so they were designated to lesser subjects. Those would be still lifes, landscapes, those things of that nature. So what Linda Nochlin was saying, that if you have this systematic kind of, just shutting out and designation that you have talent but it's going to be stifled, that there aren't any great artists. Now you can agree with that or disagree, but the point is that her putting that out there started a discourse. It started a dialogue, and it started a lot of discussion about how to change that. And so when you walk around upstairs and you see the 32-ish works we have up there, Some of the things you'll see that came out of the last 40 to 50 years is that women artists have helped shift the standard of beauty and of subject matter from a male standard to a more universal one. You know, it's not necessarily about the beautiful woman, it's sometimes about anti-beauty, and they're comfortable with that, and I'll show you a couple examples. They're questioning political and social stereotypes, and they're using unorthodox materials, and the main one we explore upstairs is fabric, and that's why originally the show was Feminism and Fabric, but, you know, I think we have a better title now, right? So, okay. So the first one we're going to look at, it's one of the first pieces you see when you walk in, is by Miriam Shapiro. And this piece is probably 6 to 7 feet across. It's pretty massive. And it's one of her robe series. And Miriam Shapiro is definitely considered a pioneer in American art, in 20th century art. And she put together, this is a painted surface with kind of block printing. Ooh, this has a, this is painted with block printing on top, like a stenciling process. And then this is fabric that's collaged and glued on. So this middle part, that's paint and fabric with almost like glitter paint around it. And then this is all fabric, and this is painted. So this mix of materials she called femage. So the femme being feminine, and the collage is the femage. And then also fabric. And so why is her use of fabric so important? It was an unorthodox material. What is fabric really associated with? Clothing, right? Who took care of clothing for centuries? Washing, mending, sewing, embroidery, knitting, quilting? Women. So it's this invisible world of women's domestic chores that are being pushed in the forefront when you use fabric. And even if a female artist working today says that's not what they're thinking about, in the art world, a 20th or 21st century female artist using fabric, that's the intimation. So that's why we wanted to explore that. So the robe is also so big, it's very pretty, it's ornamental, and but it's so big that it really doesn't define the form, right? It's just kind of this lavish, kind of imperial robe. And so she's referencing also the kimono shape. And she was referencing her other series, which is very famous, is Fans. And both of them are references to Japan and kind of the way we exoticize people like geishas in that culture instead of taking those women more seriously. So it is because of people like Miriam Shapiro kind of pushing the boundaries of these processes that weren't considered serious art-making processes that other people were able to use fabric seriously in their work too. And I'm going to show you 3 more works that kind of build off of that. So this is Leslie Dill. Excuse me. Leslie Dill we have 2 works by her in the collection, and they're both upstairs. And personally, I have a real fondness for her work. This is one of the first pieces, it's called White Threaded Poem Girl, that I recommended for acquisition 16 years ago. So I guess I'll always have an emotional attachment with it. And at the time, I didn't know it had a connection to India, which is where I'm from. So once I found that out about 10 years later, I was even more connected to it. But that aside, this is on silk. It is tea-stained, so with tea literally painted. And it's almost, I'd say, 9 or 10 feet tall, John? All right, yeah. So she is life-size, the figure, and words of an Emily Dickinson poem are all over her. And the poem is upstairs, I believe, on the label. And then these threads kind of are embroidered and attached to her, and then they come down. And the reason you see this temple over here, this is a temple in Nepal. And Leslie spent a couple of years in India, which really influenced her artistic development. And she's very interested in how text and figure overlap. So every work you see by her has those 2 components. It has a person, usually a female, and it has text. And this, you see this thing coming down from the temple? That is what she was told was the tongue of God. So you go there, it's almost 3 stories tall, and you tell the tongue of God your hopes, your dreams, your prayers, and they go straight to the heavens. And so that inspired this piece where the threads kind of become that alleyway, that pathway to the heavens or for your dreams and desires. You could read them lots of different ways. Those things could be flowing out of her or they could be flowing into her. But when you stand in front of that piece and look up at her, it's beautiful. It's really lovely. And this is another piece by Leslie, and this image doesn't quite do this piece justice. It's our biggest piece up there, and it has that same mix of figure and text. So you have this piece is almost 50 feet across and about 17 feet high. And it's a site-specific install, which means it's, can be changed according to the space you're in. So it can be made a little bit smaller or a little bit bigger. It can actually go up to 60 feet, so it can be bigger. But you have a figure, a little red figure that's about 5 feet, if it was standing, and it's sized to Leslie, and it's female. She calls it a woman. And from the female figure are all these banners that go up into the heavens. So it's the same idea as the other one. And those words that are embroidered on there are the visionary experiences of 700 people. So she thinks she had a vision when she was about 13 or 14. And then in 2001, she did this project called Tongues on Fire, where she collected the visionary experiences of 700 people. And the phrases she saw over and over, she embroidered, or she heard over and over, she embroidered onto them. And the phrases are things like, I heard a voice. Here, I've got some more of them written down here. The room is on fire. My insides melt into light. Words flood in. Time stood still. So a lot of things like that. So there's really, and the fabric moves a little bit because of our ventilation system, but the whole piece really just kind of takes your breath away. The red is brilliant and bright and celebratory, and this again goes back to the fact that in India, red is the color of celebration. It's what you wear to weddings. That's what the wedding dress is. It's usually red. And the figure is made of this kind of fabric mache process, and it's powdery, the paint is a little bit. And that references the red powder they put for spiritual blessings and things on foreheads. So it's all kind of about the joyousness of something positive. So if you guys have questions or thoughts, please feel free at any point, or I'll just ramble. So another work on fabric, but very, very different than the last couple that we've been looking at. So this is Alicia Henry. She lives in Nashville. She teaches at Fisk University, and she was in an exhibit here a few years ago. Leslie was also our first traveling exhibit that went around the country. So these are all artists that we have supported in some form or fashion. So when I say we've made it like a consistent effort, that's what I mean, to really support female artists. So this piece is also about 7 feet tall. And you have kind of this formless shift, not emphasizing a figure at all, a body at all. It's not pretty. It's made of wool and cotton. The face is made of leather and wool, and it has a kind of mask apparatus right here with the big nose. And Alicia tends to make disembodied and parts of figures, this idea of the figure never being quite whole. And there's so many layers to this work, figuratively and literally. One is that there are layers of cloth sewn together. It's wool, cotton, leather, so natural materials. And then there's this idea of masking. And I don't mean these. I mean like the idea that we all present ourselves differently in different situations, that we hide our identity or we present ourselves differently in different places, whether it's work or home or parents or school. But it also draws to mind African masking traditions, which are more spiritual, and African clowning traditions. But in this country, it really talks to stereotypes of how African Americans have been depicted, and also of like not really knowing another person, or of whites donning blackface. So there's a lot of layers here to consider. And when you're in front of this work, it's a little intense. And it's not pretty. It's this idea of anti-beauty that I mentioned earlier. She's not trying to be pretty. She is pointing out to you that things are difficult and are not always what you see. So, I really love her work. But it's an interesting thing to kind of consider and think about as you're standing in front of it. Okay, so this is one. I don't know how many of you were involved with the museum in 2007. Anyone? Maybe Andrea? Do you remember filling this form out? No? Okay. So this was a really interesting project we did. It took about a year. And so this is a husband and wife team. And so I did include 2 men in this exhibit, and they're husband and wife teams because those do exist in the art world. And this is a work that we can't get on view very often because it's massive. And so we wanted to include it. So Eric Chan and Heather Schatz are the 2 individuals, and they combined their name into Chan Schatz and said they were one person. And so, you address them that way. And they took equal responsibility for their artworks. And their artworks are what they consider really communal portraits or identities. And I'll show you the artwork in just a moment, but they gave this survey, what they called a survey, out to 400 people that made up the Hunter community. So those were staff people, board members, volunteers, guests like you. And for a year, we collected surveys. And the survey was made up of a series of choices determined by the artist. So you had these icons, you had a sector of the painting that you could indicate, you had a phrase you could choose, there were colors that you could choose, and then you signed and dated it. There's a few staff who still work here. I did one of these, she did one of these. And so it was definitely going through the filter of the artist, right? Because they chose all these things for us to mark, and then they chose how they would be combined. And so this is the work, and on the left image, right there, is the actual, that's how the color really is, and that's the painting by itself. And then they added these mirrored Plex pieces, this mirror acrylic stuff. And together they're like 25 feet across, so it's a really large piece. And so this communal portrait of the Chattanooga community and the Hunter community has this a lot of flowers, it's very bright, and then it has this kind of lobster gun that's very reminiscent of Salvador Dali, and then it has a cross. And I'm not sure where they got to this iconography from this. So, considering this and the options available, do you think this is a portrait of the artist or the Hunter community? So I find that interesting to ponder, because I really felt like they had some stereotypes that they were addressing here when it came to the gun and the cross, but maybe not. But the interesting thing here is the mirrors, when you go up there, you of course will see yourself reflected in the mirror. So then you are part of the community, right? So I thought that was very clever. And interestingly also, this is screen printed on silk, so this is also a fabric-based work. We do have a few Native American artists in our collection, and we have 2 female Native American artists upstairs. And this is Jane Quick-to-See Smith, and she's from Montana, from the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. And her work is all about the mix of trying to live in 2 different cultures at one time, the Native culture and then the rest of American society, and how those either get along or don't. She grew up in the abstract expressionist era. She's 80, and so her work has that gestural quality. It's very abstract at times. If you see her paintings, this is a print, but if you see her paintings, which are mostly in really big museums, you will see bright colors and slashes of paint and drips, very reminiscent of Robert Rauschenberg. And here you have this head that's like a square white head and a round gray head, kind of this 2-headed figure trying to coexist and perhaps struggling a little bit. And the top part says, "Our communities grapple with the house divided," right here. And down here under the bison, and you have some images here that kind of reference Native American iconography like the bison. On the bottom it says, "A great American tale, but what's the ending?" And next to it says, "A tangled web of intersecting interests." And although this was made in 96, so that's what, 24 years ago, I find it still so relevant today. Like, this is nothing's changed here. There's still all these questions that we have for not only Native communities, but others, and how we're all trying to get along, and what is the great American tale's ending. So it's an interesting piece for you to explore when you're upstairs. So how many of you have seen this painting, the French painting, before? Like everybody, right? Just about. By Edward Manet, Olympia. It's in Paris. Very famous. But the work in our collection is by Carrie Mae Weems. And Carrie Mae Weems is an African-American artist. And she is exploring the male gaze, which is this idea that women should look a certain way and have been depicted a certain way, artistically and in films, in comic books even, in pop culture. And that is that they're sensually depicted as objects, always. And so the phrase, and this is her gazing into a mirror very much in one of those poses, right? The sensual woman kind of peeking up at herself. And she says, "It was clear I was not Manet's type. Picasso, who had a way with women, only used me, and Duchamp never even considered me." And so there's a lot of things here. She's referencing 3 very famous white European artists. The painting there, Manet, has a painting of the male gaze right there, where a woman is presented in her as a lovely female form. But that painting was actually considered radical in its time, because that woman is looking back at you rather than being demure. But the only dark figure, the African figure, is black. The black figure is the maid. So that's what she means by she was not Manet's type. Picasso, who was known to be a womanizer and misogynist, didn't really relish his models, and hence the only used me. And when he did use African figures, it was kind of to take African art and use it for his own purposes rather than acknowledge the ritual use of it. And Duchamp, who was a Dada and Surrealist, really kind of deconstructed the form. He was not interested in women looking the way they were. So it's a really fun piece in a way, but it's also very much about the idea of anti-beauty and the male gaze. So there's a lot packed into some of these pieces. So I'm going to finish with our 2 newest acquisitions, which happen to be made of glass. And like fabric, glass is one of those things that's often the stepchild of the art world, okay? It's not always considered serious, even though we have many beautiful sculptures made of glass, and there's no reason why they shouldn't be. And part of that is because glass tended to be utilitarian, right? Vases, glasses, cups, windows, things that you don't take for granted. So think of stained glass windows, Gothic cathedrals, light coming in for divine light to bless the worshipers. This is Judith Schachter, and I believe this is the most recent acquisition for the Hunter before we had to close for COVID. And it is a very layered stained glass light box upstairs, and it's a little washed out here. But you see a female form laying on the ground, and she's inundated with all these flowers that a bird seems to be spewing out at her. So you could take it as kind of this metaphorical existence where we feel inundated. Someone said to me, well, that's really COVID. And I was like, okay, maybe in today's world, that's what it is. It's all the germs coming at you. But she is interested in biblical tales. And so this is really, if you think back to Gothic cathedrals, an Annunciation scene. This is Mary being visited by the Holy Spirit. So there's a lot of ways you can take this. Judith's process is very interesting, and we have it explained the best we can up there, but I would encourage you to go to her website and really read about it and look at the pictures. But it's layers and layers of glass. It looks like it's painted, and she says she hardly paints. It's mostly engraved and layers of glass to get the colors, which is very different from how stained glass was made, eons ago. And one of the things about this being kind of a craft process that's being pushed into the fine art world is that stained glass wasn't taken seriously. I mean, Tiffany fought for a long time to have his artworks taken seriously. And he employed a lot of women who never got credit for what they did either. So it's interesting that you have this woman who's right now she's got a traveling show that goes around the country with all her light stained glass windows. And they are all a little bit surreal and pushing the envelope of subject matter. And this is a work we got last November, and it's by Amber Cohen. This is probably the youngest artist in the exhibit. And again, she's using things that you might see at home on an old vase, or like a little china basket, glass basket that you might have seen growing up or something. And she gets her bits and pieces of glass from old factories that don't exist anymore, or thrift stores and antique malls. So, and then she reworks them. So she flame works, she blows, she hot sculpts. So this is both a comment on consumerism and throwaway society. These are manufacturing plants, glass manufacturing plants like Fenton Art Glass that are now no longer exist. And again, she's referencing domestic objects that would be associated with the invisible world of taking care of a home and making it something, and ornamental things that weren't taken seriously in the art world and pushing it into the art world. And this is very intricate. It's described as being grotto-like. And she tends to work monochromatically, and it is very lush and dense and really beautiful upstairs. Okay, so let me wrap up. I want you to know, I think I told you we acquired almost 100 pieces in the last 20 years. We've also, in the last 15 years, organized 31 solo exhibitions of women artists. And our other exhibits have also had women in them, of course, but just solo exhibits. And 3 exhibits of women artists that we've organized that have traveled to 10 museums around the country in the last decade. So it's a step. Those are significant steps. We clearly have a lot more to do. But one of the great things about Linda Nochlin kind of helping prod that discussion forward and all these women making work and not being hampered is that artists who are coming into this world today have both male and female artists to look up to. And hopefully they can name more than those 3 that we all can name, right? So, well, thank you guys for coming, and please enjoy upstairs. And we have a lot more women artists than are upstairs throughout the galleries. So if you haven't been lately, look for an icon. It's like a little pink icon, and that's a woman artist. So, thanks.